I know that the Chancellor has been away, so let me update her on the mess that she left behind.
Why did I go to China? Well, I went to secure tangible benefits for British businesses trading overseas.
This whole sorry tale is nothing short of a Shakespearean tragedy. To go or not to go, that is now a question.
The Chancellor should not have gone to China.
When will the Chancellor realise no matter what deals she does around the world, and I welcome them, Rome is burning around her?
It's beyond parody that His Majesty's Chancellor would go and throw herself at the mercy of the Chinese government and come back with £600 million.
The British people deserve better.
Well, it was not a victorious homecoming for Rachel Reeves. She went to China, one of the world's biggest economies, to, as the government put it, re-engage with China and boost economic growth in the UK. But not only has the deal she's come back with been described as humiliating, she's also been criticised for even going in the first place. That's because the markets back here in Britain were floundering. The pound took a dive as the UK's cost of borrowing soared, and the opposition has accused the Chancellor of fleeing to China. Whatever the circumstances of her visit, our reporter, Ella Morgan, looks at what she achieved there.
This was supposed to be the story. Smiles and handshakes as China and Britain restart financial talks, which have been frozen since 2019. At the end of the Chancellor's two-day visit, the big announcement.
The total value of what we have agreed today is worth £600 million over the next 5 years for the UK economy.
That's fallen a little flat, with critics in the opposition calling £600 million a piddling amount. The deals include measures like lifting barriers to imports and exports, new licences for British businesses to operate in China, and closer ties when it comes to combating climate change and investing in environmentally sustainable projects. But the Shadow Chancellor said it wasn't worth the trip.
Whatever was on the menu in China, was it really worth the unedifying sight of an increasingly desperate politician scampering halfway around the world with a begging bowl?
Then there's the continuing security concerns when it comes to UK-China relations. In the past year, 2 people have been charged with spying for China, and another suspect has been banned from the UK. In fact, there's been a rise in arrests for Chinese espionage in several European countries. A European Parliament aide was arrested in Germany in April, and the Dutch government says the Netherlands has been targeted by China. But Rachel Reeves has also been criticised for making the trip when markets back home were in trouble. The value of the pound fell as the cost of UK borrowing soared. Borrowing costs have risen across Europe, but many economists say it's worse in the UK because of some of the Chancellor's measures in her tax-heavy budget back in October. That's led to many commentators to draw comparisons with one of her predecessors, Kwasi Kwarteng. His budget under Liz Truss sparked similar economic turmoil, and they were both out of their government jobs soon after. The current Prime Minister says Rachel Reeves has his full support, but that hasn't stopped others calling for her to go.
Well, I'm joined by someone who might have some idea of what Rachel Reeves is going through at the moment. Kwasi Kwarteng, former Chancellor under Liz Truss. Welcome.
Hello, Nick.
Well, let's get straight to it. Can you relate to Rachel Reeves at the moment? You know, the claims that she's crashed the economy, that she should go. I mean, do you have sleepless nights? Does it all come back?
No, not anymore. But clearly I had my time under massive pressure. And I think for her, it'll be quite a lonely place because she will only have done what Keir Starmer wanted to do. There's no sense in which she's operating her own policy outside of what the Labour government want to do. And if they do get rid of her, which a lot of the media are saying they should, that will just simply focus the attention on the Prime Minister. He's not going to get out of jail.
We'll come to that. But she was in this really difficult position where she'd lined up this meeting to go to China, and there were calls from your party, the opposition, saying, don't go. Should she have gone to China?
So I think with China, she probably shouldn't have gone. I was in a similar situation where I had to go to the IMF, but that was an international conference. And I felt that, and it's an annual get-together of the IMF, And I felt very strongly that if I didn't go, that would send the wrong signal to the market. Because the market
But wouldn't
wouldn't
she
say...
have done exactly the same?
That was the danger. That's the balance. I think, given that it was just one country and it wasn't an international get-together, I think she probably should have stayed. But it's a very finely balanced decision.
What you didn't experience is what has been happening now. In the Treasury, the economic minister, Tulip Sadiq, she had to resign because she effectively had become involved with questionable corruption claims from Bangladesh about her houses, for example. Now the pressure on the Chancellor being piled on by media, by politicians. Isn't it time, really, just for the Prime Minister to say, hey, let's clear out the House and start again?
I think that would be insane, and I'll explain why. If you look at the history of the last 20, 30 years, Prime Ministers falling out with Chancellors essentially meant that the Prime Minister's days were numbered. I remember when Margaret Thatcher got rid of Lawson, and then John Major came in. He essentially was unsackable. The minute a Prime Minister sacks a Chancellor, the new Chancellor is unsackable because they can't do it twice. And all the attention and pressure goes to the Prime Minister because they say, why did you appoint her? Why did you sack her? Your government's fallen apart. And that's exactly what happened with me and Liz Truss. In fact, I thought when she sacked me, she would have 3 weeks. She resigned within, I think, 6 days. And 11 days after I left number 11, Rishi Sunak came into number 10. That's how quick it was. And I think that he would have the same pressure.
But there is a difference. You were effectively in power in the last years after a very long term of a Conservative government. Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, at the beginning of their term, 6-7 months into it, wouldn't it be a perfect time to change course years away from an election that would give them a fresh start?
I think you're right, but the problem or the issue that you're overlooking is they actually believe this stuff. They're socialists. They're people who believe in high taxes, high government spending, big state. That's what drew them to the Labour Party in the first place. They're not Blairites, they're not centrists, they are socialists. And given that mentality, I think they're just going to double down on these policies that I think are flawed and are wrong.
You said Keir Starmer would be mad to get rid of Rachel Reeves because it exposes him. I mean, how fickle is a Prime Minister's support, though?
I think it can be very fickle. And I think that if he gets rid of her, the media won't say, oh, thank God, thank the Lord, we've got this shiny new Chancellor, everything's okay. The media will ask questions about his judgment. They'll ask questions about his temperament. They'll ask questions about his whole government, his whole the direction of the government. But aren't
they doing that already?
They are doing that, but those questions will intensify. And as you know, I lived through this directly, and I said exactly the same thing when I was Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Prime Minister sacked me. I said, you know, I was polite. I didn't say you're nuts, but I did say this is not going to work for you because they'll come after you and you won't survive for very long. And that's exactly what happened. And that's exactly, I think, what would happen in this scenario. Some
would say, actually, that she is currently a lightning rod for all the problems, that if he did dispense with his Chancellor now, or she resigned, but ultimately he dispensed with her, that his backbenchers would rally behind him, because we're already hearing mutterings of some of his own, off the record admittedly, backbench MPs saying she's only got 6 months to prove there can be growth. She's only got a year.
So I think that's a separate issue. So the growth question, which I think they will struggle to deliver on, I think contaminates the whole government. I don't see how he can blame somebody for not getting growth and somehow survive unscathed. I think that'll be a huge damage to his reputation as the head of the government, and the government would be undermined. I think in terms of where he and she are, I mean, this is just a fact of British political life. I think number 10 and number 11, the dynamics between them are very intensely watched, and it's very rare that someone in number 10 can dispense of the Chancellor without getting significant pushback.
Okay. All right, listen, lots of comparisons to Chancellor Rachel Reeves are being made with your former boss, Liz
Sure.
Truss. The most notable is, of course, the famous comparison where Liz Truss was compared to a lettuce and not having the shelf life of a lettuce.
She looks like a character out of Harry Potter. I mean, that looks like Voldemort or something.
Well,
like that.
it's meant to be a lettuce. So here's Rachel Reeves now being picked up with the shelf life they're suggesting of a lettuce. So my point about this is, are there real comparisons between what Rachel Reeves is going through and the state of the British economy with what it was like when you were Chancellor and Liz Truss was Prime Minister?
The question, the fundamental question that she's trying to solve was the question that we were trying to address. How do you get growth in the British economy? How do you get growth? And it's not just a British problem, it's across the Western world. I mean, but not so much in the United States, but across Europe. People are grappling with how you get growth. Now, we had a growth plan. The markets reacted against that. I think there was panic. I was removed. Truss was out within days, within a week or two. I think with Rachel Reeves, she's gone for a more direct, I would say, socialist route. And I think that will not work.
The same outcome, though. The high interest rates on bonds, the pound is right down compared to a recent peak.
That's right.
These are the indicators of the lack of confidence in the British economy, which is supported by some pretty heavy criticism from business as well.
I think so. And I think what happened in the budget, you know, we did the opposite of what she was trying to do. We cut taxes. It was unfunded and the market spooked. But what we were trying to do was reduce the burden of taxation on businesses and on entrepreneurs and people in general. What she's done is the opposite of that. She's raised taxes on business. She's brought in farmers into inheritance tax for the first time.
Okay, but isn't the only lesson, Kwasi, from that doesn't really matter what the Chancellor does, the markets are controlling the fates of our government?
Yeah, but the markets are responding to what the Chancellor does. I mean, nobody forced her to put up taxes on employers. That was the decision of the Labour government. And before we blame her too much as the Chancellor, this was a government. This is how the Labour Party thinks in government. They think that the money's there with capitalists, with employers, and that they can somehow tax the wealth creators to redistribute and pay for the public sector. That's exactly what she tried to do in the budget. And of course, you reach a point, as I think we have done, where people in the private sector are thinking, hang on a minute, you know, I can't be taxed endlessly. I'll either leave and set up a business abroad, or I won't hire people, and I won't expand. And that's what's putting pressure on the economy.
So if, instead of me sitting here, it was the Chancellor Rachel Reeves, what would you say to her? What would your advice be?
The first thing she has to do is to make sure that the Prime Minister has her back, because she needs to be talking to the Prime Minister on a very regular basis.
Because you don't think Liz Truss had your back in the end?
Well, she sacked me, so, I mean, after 6 weeks, so, I mean, that's demonstrably the case. She didn't have my back. She thought by getting rid of me, she would somehow preserve her life in number 10. In fact, the opposite happened. I think she probably would have lasted a bit longer. But we don't need to go back to the history. That's over. I think with Rachel Reeves, she's got to be talking to Keir Starmer all the time, making sure that he's involved in the discussions. And then the second thing she's got to do is be very calm. Now, if she knows that she's got the Prime Minister's back, and for the reasons I've said, I think she probably will. He won't get rid of her now. He might shuffle her out in 6 months down the track. She could end up being in a different department, but he won't sack her now. And once she's established that relationship, I think she's got to work out, what her plan is, what she's going to say, because it's very likely, I'm afraid, that the OBR will revise down the Office of Budget Responsibility in March. That's right,
which will create more problems for her.
That will. So she's got to have a story to explain and rationalise that.
Well, perhaps we'll have you back, if not her, to explain the story when it comes in March, when the Office for Budget Responsibility do report. Kwasi Kwarteng,
Thank you.
former Chancellor, thanks for joining us here on Westminster Watch.
Thank you.
Let's talk a bit more widely now about both the trip to China and the state of the UK's economy. I'm joined by Charles Parton, advisor to the Council on Geostrategy, and Nick Parsons, economist and founder of Simply Macro Strategy. Nick, let me turn to you. Welcome to you both to Westminster Watch, first of all. Was this trip to China worth it? 600 million quid, hey?
It's not a lot of money in the great scheme of things. If we to give you a bit of context on this, the UK exports 30 billion a year of goods and services to China, and we import around 55 billion a year. So we're running a deficit.
A lot of the nation are saying, hang on, China, they're spying on us. They're already one of our largest trading partners. Why are we building stronger relations with a country that doesn't actually really like us, but seems quite happy to sell to us?
Well, the nation has some point in the sense that protecting our own national and actually economic security is the number one priority. And to be fair to Rachel Reeves and to David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, they both said that. But at the same time, China is very important, not just in trade and investment, but in global health, in climate change, very much so. It's the biggest emitter, in AI governance and a whole range of things. So it's not just about which you're right, Nick, were very small amounts of money in the great scheme of things, assuming, of course, they go ahead, because ministers often come back with large deals under their belt which never actually eventuate.
Let me point to Germany. Many people say for 10 years Germany's had a very pro-China relationship. In fact, they've just recently indicted 3 people for spying on behalf of China there. Fundamentally, China doesn't seem to like Western European countries very much, do they? And yet we seem to have just gone cap in hand to them.
I think you're absolutely right in the sense that China sees us as hostile forces, and it really wants to take over the leadership of the world and do us and our values down. So we have to accept that that is the way it is, and we've got to deal with it the way it is, which means dealing with it with your shields and protections well in place before you start talking about economic benefits. And what the Chinese want is technology, and we don't necessarily want to give our technology to their investment. That could be very dangerous when much of this technology these days has military and repression as well as civilian use.
Okay, Nick, look, we've talked a little bit about the economic value of this trip. What made it so topical here in the UK is not just the security issues we've been talking about, but actually also it's been set against quite a big economic bleak picture here in the UK. In a word, before I try and set out the key issues, how bad is the British economy at the moment?
Well, I think the timing of the trip, if we're being generous, was probably unfortunate, because the spotlight is very much on financial markets. This trip had been arranged well before and well in advance of the timing of this particular bout of market nerves. It's not yet a crisis.
And what were these things happening in the market? What are we talking about here?
So we face a backdrop where we've got little or no economic growth. In the 4 months since the election back in early July, the UK economy has shrunk in 3 of them and barely shown growth in the other one. So it's a background of economic stagnation. It's a background at which unemployment is rising slightly and is set to rise, I think, substantially over the coming quarters. So in economic terms, it's a very, very difficult backdrop.
And what brought this to the head was the market reaction to those rather depressing statistics that you've been talking about. We know that the bond market has been particularly reaching unusual high levels of interest. But not for your benefit, gentlemen, but for many people's benefit, including mine. Here's Alex to explain exactly what's been going on with the bond markets.
Thanks, Nick. Now, all countries borrow money, and a common way to do that is through bonds. In the UK, these government bonds are called gilts. They're loans, so when an investor buys a gilt, say for £100, they are lending the government that money. Let's imagine interest rates are 2%. The government will pay investors an annual coupon of £2 a year for a certain amount of time, let's say 10 years. After those 10 years, the bond matures, and the investor gets their original £100 back on top of the £20 that they've earned in interest. So borrowing that money just cost the government £20 over 10 years. But interest rates for these gilts have been rising in the UK, meaning the UK government has to spend more to borrow. Recently, the interest rate on a 10-year gilt rose to 4.86%. That's a 17-year high. And for a 30-year gilt, it reached 5.42%, the highest for 27 years. Part of that rise is because gilts can be bought and sold. So if market confidence is low and an investor is worried about getting their money back or they're not happy with the interest rate, they'll sell, even if it's at a slightly cheaper price. That drives up the interest rate because if they resell the bond for, say, £90, but it still has an interest of £2 a year, that's suddenly not 2%, but 2.2%. And when you think about the total value of UK's gilts is trillions of pounds, that 0.2% can make a big difference. Add to all this the fact that the value of the pound fell to its lowest against the US dollar for over a year, and inflation remains stubbornly high. That's all led to the markets feeling very wobbly.
So that's what Rachel Reeves has been having to deal with recently. How serious are those bond rates and the collapse in the currency for the British economy?
Well, I think, first of all, that was an absolutely excellent summary. The UK government has outstanding around £2.5 trillion of government bonds, of gilt-edged securities. And the interest rate, the interest bill has risen, as was just so well explained. The interest rate has risen by the order of £7 or £8 billion a year. Now, that dwarfs some of the departmental expenditures that we've got. So we're going to have to be, our taxes are being used to pay the interest.
All these other things, schools, education and so forth.
Schools, education, the health service and everything.
OK, now how much of this crisis in the market is down to Rachel Reeves' budget last October?
Well, I don't think it's yet a crisis. I think we should be clear about that. It has the potential to become one, but it's not there yet. These markets move in cycles. They go up and down, not necessarily in that order. But the market movements that we've had thus far are serious. They're enough to be a concern, but they're not specific UK concerns insofar as it relates to the bond market. They are when it comes to the currency market. The UK pound, the British pound, is the worst performing major currency this year. So we are seeing some sense of unease there.
And what about the rest of the world? The Rachel Reeves's defence is actually what's happening in the bond markets is happening elsewhere. Is that true, or is the UK an outlier?
There is some truth in that. The US rates, if we go back to early December, US rates are up around 70 basis points, 0.7%. The UK is up around 60 basis points. Elsewhere in Europe, Germany and France are up between 30 and 40 basis points. So yes, there is some truth in the fact that it's an international phenomenon, but it's also the case that the UK has done relatively worse than many of our major competitors. So a bit of both would be the answer there.
So Charlie, we kind of got an explanation now of what's been going on here with all those key market indicators in the UK. But bringing this back to the mission of the Labour government to go for growth and China, a lot of time has been invested in China now, a lot of political capital, but we're going to have a new president. He doesn't want to do business really with China. He's not a great fan of them. Does that put at risk the, if you like, the trading relationships, the huge trading relationship we have with the United States?
Well, I'd bow to Nick in the sense of I'm not an expert on what happens to markets and business when there's so much uncertainty around. And the one quality that Trump brings to all this is uncertainty. I mean, even in the relationship with China, after all, Elon Musk is said to be very close to him and giving him close advice. Elon Musk has very large interests in China, which he won't want to see prejudiced by action by the new president. So we don't really know how that's all that's going to work yet.
If the new President Trump comes out and says, I don't think UK, you should be doing that, he can make life difficult for us.
He can make life.
Do you think he will?
I think he can make life extremely difficult for us. And I think the case of electric vehicles is one that we may need to focus on, because the Americans have put 100% tariffs on that. The Europeans have put up to 38% on that. And here are we with very minimal tariffs. Do we think that the American president is going to say, well, carry on, UK, keep producing vehicles, Chinese vehicles or whatever, without tariffs? Meanwhile, we're, of course, putting tariffs on ours. For sure not.
Nick, on that point, can Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, have his cake and eat it, do business with China and forge a close trading and diplomatic relationship with our key ally, America, do you think?
Well, I used to explain things to my kids by saying it's possible but not probable. And I think that will be my judgment of this one at the moment. It's possible, but perhaps not probable.
But don't forget also that America trades very, very extensively with China. I mean, nobody is saying we shouldn't trade with China. And where investment is suitable, and I'm afraid that scope is narrowing because of the technology issues and security issues. But where it's not an issue, of course we should go ahead and trade with China.
Okay, but one very quick answer from each of you on this. Trump has threatened big tariffs, and we're not quite sure where they're going to go, but they could pretty much go anywhere, which will affect his trading relationship. Do you think he will impose blanket tariffs in his first few months as president that will work against Britain's interests?
If I had to guess, I would say that we're going to see some disruptive tariffs. At what level, I don't know.
How badly would they hurt us?
Well, I think it's the threat of tariffs which is almost as important as the tariffs themselves. And we've already seen various countries beginning to adapt to what they perceive to be Trump's likely policies.
We'll be back to discuss the future of the British economy under President Trump, I'm sure. Thanks to you both for joining me here. Nick, Charlie, for coming on to Westminster Watch. Extremely grateful. Thanks again to all my guests for joining me. And don't forget to subscribe to the TRT World YouTube channel for more lively debate and conversation. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.